and I can do the official welcomes. There's a script here. I actually am not going to read it because you guys are going to hear it all a million times by the time we're done with this. So we'll spare you all, honestly. And besides, I think I know almost everybody who's hanging out here right now, so it should be fine. I'll put the things that you're supposed to know in the chat if anybody hasn't seen it 1,000 times already. And the main thing is at the end of the whole kit and caboodle, there's a survey, right? That's what I really want you to do.
Okay.
But it's at the end of the whole conference, so don't even worry about that right now. And that's it. So Pat, yeah, kick it off.
All right. Well,
One of the authors, there's Bryan.
okay. Wayne, your mute is okay. All right, good. Well, I'm so delighted that I get a chance to introduce you guys to two dear friends of mine. I met Bryan Post after he sent me a game-changing book almost 20 years ago, 18 years ago, Beyond Consequences, Logic, and Control. It's a book that reframed the way we parent kids. And at the time, we weren't teaching this information. So he's a real breakthrough person in our field. And I brought him into Brooklyn. I ran an organization called You Gotta Believe at the time, met his family, and we've been friends ever since. Like you just mentioned, I was at his wedding a few years back.
That's right.
And I also met Angela probably, well, when Everclosure came out. I actually came up to Harlem and I met you there. And then I've been following your career ever since. And then when your book, You Should Be Grateful, came out, and I'm not a big reader of books, and I was so happy that it was on audio. And I listened to every single word. I listened to every single word in your voice. And Bryan and Angela will be in person at our conference next Thursday. Angela's opening the conference. Bryan's closing the first day. And we just wanted to have a chat, particularly about Angela's most recent book, You Should Be Grateful. Both Bryan and Angela happen to be adopted persons. Bryan's also an adoptive parent. And I really wanted my two friends to meet each other. And I believe this is the first time they're seeing each other because we did have a phone conversation earlier in the week.
It is indeed.
Okay, I'd just like to turn this over to you.
Well, thanks, Pat. A pleasure, Angela.
Yeah, excited.
Hey, so I just want to jump in and comment and ask a question because my background is primarily in the exploration of childhood trauma and brain science and stress and how that leads to behaviors. And in your documentary, one of the first things I heard was, I believe it's the foster parent held you and caressed you and
Yes.
loved on you and relaxed you.
Yes.
You were able to relax because you were born clenched, which to me indicates being born in a state of survival and potentially even a level of failure to thrive. And when I heard that, I was like, whoa, it was so powerful.
Yes.
That this stranger held this sweet little baby and had the intuition, because that would have been what I don't know when you were born. I don't want to date you, but that would have been.
I am 38, 1985.
So that would have been before any neuroscience, and actually there was probably a lot of harsh parenting going on back then. What impact do you feel like that those early critical experiences had on your life?
Oh man, it's so cool to talk to you because that's really not the first thing that many people talk about from the film. It eventually gets to talking about my foster family, but even then it's not so honed in on this really crucial touch that I got. I really credit my foster parents for my ability to have healthy relationships.
Wow.
Like, I have been married to my husband, who's also named Bryan with a Y, which I love your name spelling. We've been married for 15 years. We got married pretty young, just because
Amazing.
naive and whatever. And we have a lovely marriage, and I credit my foster parents. They yeah, I
Did
don't
you
know
meet them?
exactly when they got me. Mhm.
Did you meet them? Have you met them? Do you know them?
Yes, I met them around the same time that I reunited with my birth parents, so about 10 years ago. My parents had tried to stay in touch with them throughout my life, but it was really hard. And I think it's partially because they just loved me so well. And it was like the opposite of what I hear so many foster parents say, which is like, I don't want to get too attached, so I'm gonna like have kind of this guard up. They had no guard. I know from how they talk to me today, they love me so well that they actually gave me a different name too, which is really important to me, but I don't have that name, unfortunately. But my name Angela was given to me by a social worker through like a Rolodex.
Mhm.
When I was not born, I was born without a name, and then they're just like, "Well, just do the name Angela," like the first business card in their Rolodex. And so my foster parents were like, "No, that's not good enough." And so they like prayed over me, thought about it, got to know me, and gave me a name, Jocelyn Kate, which I think is gorgeous. But at the same time, the flyer was going out for me to be adopted across the country, trying to find a home, and they forgot to make the switch. So they kept that name Angela on the flyer. So that's what my adoptive parents got to know me as. But I do think that those hours and hours that they spent like rotating my hips to loosen them up in order to be able to put a diaper on me,
Amazing.
that one-on-one attention,
Mm.
I can't, I can hardly articulate what it did for my body. And then to hear all of the doctors really flummoxed by how I not only don't have spastic quadriplegia, which was the diagnosis, but I don't have too many hints of cerebral palsy either. I do have hearing loss, but yeah, I credit my foster parents.
It's fantastic. It's and it's so hard to believe in the society that we live in, and I can only imagine the sheer impact that had and the presence, the oxytocin presence the foster parents must have had to be able to slow down, to spend that time with you, and probably not even really understanding that they were completely rewiring your brain at the most critical stage in your development, which set you up so strongly for the person you are now. And then I also saw in the video where you were hooping with your husband and you were schooling him. I was like, oh my God, that girl's got some skills. I think that was 10, that documentary was 10 years old,
10
right?
years old. Yeah.
Can you still hoop?
I can, and my husband would tell you that his knees are feeling old. He's a couple years older than me, so yeah, I've got the edge, thank
That's
goodness.
fantastic.
Something interesting was when I did meet I met my birth mom, like officially met her, and my foster parents on the same trip to Tennessee where they all live. When I met my mom specifically, my foster dad a little bit too, the way I felt next to her was how I thought I would feel meeting my birth mother. It was a sense of like, I recognize her smell. And I couldn't get close enough to her. Like we were sitting next to each other and I kind of sidled up to touch her legs, like so we were leg to leg. I just couldn't get close enough. And that was kind of an overwhelming and unusual feeling for me. It was like I knew her.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm sensing a little bit of quiver even in your voice now as you talk about it.
It is true, Mr. Therapist Brian Post, because I just don't think in all the work that I've done, it's just not common for people to hone in on my foster parents and their impact.
Well, I'd like to expound on that just a little bit because you should be grateful as a overarching statement that many adopted children experience. The very statement, you should be grateful, when in fact your very earliest experiences were from were traumatic. I'll just say that as an infant, the in utero experience, but then your fostering experience, completely unexpected, your adoption experience. No one has to tell you that you should be grateful. You are of gratitude,
Absolutely.
you know? And I think that there's so much to unpack in those core experiences and how they shape us later as adults. But thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing that because that's vulnerable stuff.
What did you feel with the title? What were your initial thoughts?
You know, I was fortunate. I don't think anyone ever told me that I should be grateful because I was adopted. I was adopted as an infant, like you, and my parents were Black. Funny enough, my parents were Black, but we grew up in an all-white neighborhood in a all-white town. So it's an interesting little paradox, you
Yeah.
know. But I don't think anyone ever told me that I should be grateful. So I never had that experience. But it's always there's a real dichotomy, and I see it in adoption, especially with adult adoptees. Kind of the conflict between being angry at someone versus having to realize that whoever it was and whatever you experienced, it's what got you through life to where you are now.
Yeah, and wrestling with the unknown, hearing folks say you could be fill in the blank, dead, homeless, always assuming the worst from birth
Mhm.
parent raising, even if they don't know them. I think
Mhm.
that's also another paradox that I feel because I feel like I get really defensive when people make that assumption. You
Mhm.
should be grateful. You should be so glad you got adopted. If you weren't, imagine what your life would be. You wouldn't be who you are. I f- feel very defensive. Like you don't know. And neither do I.
That's right. It's an assumption. I would say that I, on the other hand, am grateful that I was adopted because I was conceived out of wedlock by a woman who was still married.
Mhm.
And she's still married to her husband to this day. And I'm in reunion with them, and and he thought I had been aborted. So up on the reunion, he was the first person out of the door to give me a hug and say, I'm sorry, I couldn't bear another man's burden. And they had a pretty tough stint for a number of years. My half siblings, we've talked about it, and I'm grateful that I didn't grow up in that environment,
Mm,
because I have a belief that it would have shaped me in a different way, in a different capacity.
True. I believe that too.
So throughout the book, the stories you share, and throughout your experience, you've done so much in the field of adoption. It is amazing.
Thank you.
I want to compliment you on that. What is your core sense of the struggle between the interface between the adopted child, adopted adult, and the rest of the world, even the adoptive parents.
My core feeling, and I feel like what drives most of my work, is that no matter how you were adopted, when you were adopted, the circumstances, that all adoptees have really deep and complicated feelings that currently we don't have enough places to explore it without being pathologized or just outright told we're wrong for feeling a certain way, that kind of thing. I don't think it's acceptable yet to explore the complexities, and that's, I feel like that's my whole mission.
Hmm. Do you think people get too hung up on race in adoption?
Who are the people? Which people?
Professionals, mostly professionals, because really it's the professionals. Well, I won't say mostly professionals, but the lay person, especially when it comes to, white families adopting Black children or Korean children. And do you see similarities in the judgments and perceptions across the cultures?
I certainly don't think I wouldn't say that professionals get too hung up on race, because I think it's a very important thing. I just think that professionals aren't able to go deep enough yet. So their
Mm.
focus is literally on skin color. When what we're actually talking about is history. I try really hard to work with white adoptive parents who love their Black kids, who are saying things like, I wish that my kids' birth parents would be open to us. Like, we invite them over, but they don't want to come over. Why is that? We're great people. And I'm like, because of what you represent as a white person. Can you think about their experience? Maybe think about where they live, why they live where they live, and all of these things. And that you might just be a reflection of that. So it's not that you yourself, they're not able to see you and the good person you are and all the values and morals and ethics and beliefs around wanting openness for your kid. You represent a history of using the word trauma, because that's the case for America.
Mm.
I I think professionals get hung up on race when what we need to be talking more about is classism, and how that, because yeah, so I think we are stuck a little bit. I don't necessarily believe in the National Association Black Social Workers position statement of 1972 that says that transracial adoption is racial genocide. I don't believe that.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that it can reflect a genocide if white parents haven't thought critically beyond, we're going to take the kid to a certain restaurant, make sure they're at a Black hair salon, like kind of checking these things off. That's not good enough. That's not what we're talking about.
I'm so that's very interesting what you're saying. I would go so
Tell
far
me what
as
you're really thinking.
no, I love that, because I don't, I don't think in those capacities. So I always like being exposed to different thoughts and dimensions. For me, I would think that the parents of a child that they had to place for adoption would be challenged to go visit them in their new adopted placements, less because of what those adopted parents, what they symbolize or what they represent, and more because of the guilt and the shame and the grief the biological parent would feel in the experience. It's so intimate and vulnerable. And I think what we don't
Yes.
do is we don't share in the grief and the
Yes.
loss and the pain. And so because we don't share in the grief and the loss and the pain, it's easy to get mired down in the leaves of the tree. When
Yes.
when underneath the leaves is the root, which is where we're all at. Right? What is that shared connection that's there, especially in adoption? You know, when my
Yes.
two mothers got together, it was sadness. It was sadness, and then it was joy, and then it was sadness, and it was joy. But it probably would have not happened, you know, had I not searched.
Okay, so I think I understand. And what I feel is, yes, absolutely. One aspect of birth parents feeling perhaps not a desire to have openness is, yes, it's really hard to see this family parenting my child. They're doing it. I couldn't, just that
Mm,
basic, sure. But I absolutely believe that racism, and when it is transracial, adds another layer. Like,
oh, for sure.
so, but yeah, I was working with a family just recently who really want to do what you said and share in the sadness that this needed to happen with the child's biological mother. But the block for them is that they feel so indebted basically to this birth mother for what they would say giving them
Yeah,
her child,
yeah.
that they are unable to, like, it's like their prefrontal cortex is out the door. They're just like,
Mhm.
whatever she wants we'll do, kind of thing.
Mm,
And it's unhealthy.
mm.
And so in the same way, I feel
So
like this is what
interesting.
has happened when I asked my birth mother, what did you think when you first found out I was raised by white people? Her initial response was like, oh, that's great. I'm so glad you got the white people's education. And then when I pressed her a little further and I was like, do you know what the white people's education, like, what does that mean to you? She
Mhm.
was like, I've only met a handful of nice white people in my life.
Wow.
I'm so glad you got one of them. It looks like you've got one of them. And so her understanding of like what my life was, she can't really go there until she can get through on what her beliefs are about white people from the Northwest.
Sure. Which is generational conditioning and experiences, and a lot of trauma experiences around race and race relations, especially when she was growing up. So she would
All of
definitely
that.
live with that dichotomy, right? I mean,
Right.
yeah, I'm glad you got the white person's experience. Very
Yeah. You know, to her, it's like you got the pass on all the things because she's been
yeah,
seeing that happen. But for her, life is just a series of barriers.
yes, yes.
And so that's hard for me because I think even still today, I don't know if she really has a true sense of what my life was like, even though
Yeah, I
we've
can't
talked a
imagine.
ton.
Yeah, I can't imagine she would. That would be almost that's like watching a TV show. It'd be like watching a
Yes.
movie. Yeah,
Yes.
outside of her paradigm.
Yeah, it's
'Cause we don't know.
completely outside.
So,
And so that's when we talk about your first question of, do professionals talk about race too much? It's like that's the conversation we want to be having. It's like,
mm,
why might it be hard for the birth parents and adoptee to all have a genuine understanding of each other, the losses and gains, when we're putting families together who would have never otherwise known each other.
yeah, and so when you say the losses and gains, I go back to the shared grief that has to connect everyone at some level. You know, adoptive parents have some experiences that guide their decision making when it comes to adoption. Those experiences could have started when they were super young. And then you have the loss that the adopted child experiences. And then you have the loss that the biological parents experience, primarily the biological mother, but there's a biological father in there too. And
Yes.
so it's interesting that we typically want to seek understanding of someone else and their experience, or we hope that they will, but we don't even have a deep understanding of our own experience.
Right.
Which then prevents us as parents. So if you're my adopted child, my own personal experience and my grieving any losses is imperative for me to be able to really be present to you to grieve your losses,
Yes. And
because
that's
otherwise you get overwhelmed.
one area that I feel like private newborn infant adoptions are doing a little bit better is working with prospective adopters who are adopting because of infertility
Mm.
to grieve that first. I have been like kind of pleased by that development in the last decade.
Oh, that's fantastic. I wonder what that looks like in practice, that grieving.
What I hear from parents is just like going through the deep feelings of who your child would have been, who you
Mm.
think they would have been, what they would have looked like, what their interests may have been, and all of that. And just like spending a lot of time with that
Yeah,
and
I
being
think
okay.
that's a great addition to definitely to the early adopting process.
Yeah, so when you adopt a child that you no longer are maybe subconsciously hoping that they look like you, act like you, talk like you, all those things.
When the Black social worker, the former head of the NASWB, when she came up and made the, what was the exact statement she made? You've lost your
Cultural
identity.
genocide.
Yeah, yeah.
Cultural genocide. She said that there is no way that she was talking white and black, but no way that white parents can adequately imbue the skills needed for black children to be in this country.
What do you think that even means?
I do think what I think it means is that we do need I needed a black role model, mentor.
Mm.
That yes, it is like there's a reason why we are talking more about the importance of mirroring to see like for me when I didn't even realize I was doing this, but my mom would tell me she's told me in adulthood that there were times when she would like suggest a book that I might love because I love reading. I'd be like, "Oh, cool, mom, thanks. I'll get it." But a black woman would say the same thing, like, "Hey, I think you might like this book." And I would just be like, "Mom," I would go home, "Mom, I need you to get this book right now." Like I just learned about it, when in
Mm.
fact that wasn't the case. But
Mhm.
there's something about mirroring and the lack of does, I think, make it really hard to understand who we are. I am working with an adoptee club at Howard University, an HBCU, and it is fully made up of transracially adopted Black students who grew up in predominantly white areas and are so happy to be at the HBCU, but it's like absolutely discombobulating.
Mhm.
They've never had that before.
Mhm.
So that's kind of it's that deracination, I think, is what they're getting to that actually really matters.
I
Do you
think it.
disagree?
No, I don't disagree at all. I think it's very important. It wasn't until I went to college at 17 that I had significant interactions with my Black peers, because I played football. So all the half the dudes on the football team were all brothers. And so that was my first real experience. And it was important. It was important.
Yeah. I think one thing, I don't know if you're, one thing I do feel is that conversations about race and transracial adoption do dominate a lot of the adoption discourse in a way that I don't think is great, but
Mhm.
I understand why. Like the issues are they're easier to see.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that's great, you know.
Mhm. Well, I think again, I think you're absolutely right. That's where we can place our focus. That because in lieu of addressing deeper, more painful things, that's
Yes.
something I feel like we can latch onto and make a
Yes.
point of dissension, a point of agreement, whatever it may be. Which I'm challenged by that, but I don't spend a lot of time in that arena because my focus is on trauma. So I'm like, let's deal with the trauma, let's deal with the pain, let's deal with the grief. All this other outer stuff is important, but what's this inner stuff that
Yes.
we're not talking about and we're not getting real about? I can be mad at my white parents or my black parents or my biological mother, my biological dad all day long. But am I really doing the hard inner work that's ultimately going to lead to my life happiness or my life dissatisfaction? And to me, that is really important. I spend a great deal of time desiring for individuals to take personal responsibility for grieving their traumas and their pains and not allowing themselves to be burdened and held hostage by their past experiences.
Yeah.
Discussing your past experiences is important, but you've got to be willing to go into the emotion of them and the feeling of them and honor those feelings and allow yourself some freedom, because
Yeah.
it's of us, it's a part of our story, but it isn't us.
Yeah.
I see and hear a lot of adoptees getting trapped in that.
Curious what you think about this. Some people have posed to me this idea that a birth parent has experienced trauma. They're in a crisis. The adoptee is experiencing trauma, whether they're adopted at birth or foster care, but adoptive parents may not have. And so I've heard some adoptive parents who are oppressed in some way
Mm.
state that they feel like they are better equipped for this whole adoption constellation because they are gay. Therefore, they understand the needs and what it feels like, or they have a disability. And so, therefore, and I'm like, I don't love trauma comparisons. And
Yeah.
it does leave me scratching my head a little bit like, do they
Well,
have
I wouldn't say anyone's better or less equipped. I think our experiences are what mold us into becoming the people that we become to move into the relationship and the situation. And it's just like the adoptive parents that we pass judgment and say, well, they're not experiencing any trauma. They didn't, well, you don't know what their walk has been. They may not have any trauma associated to adoption,
Yeah.
but they have trauma in their life. And that shows up, and that's an important part. But there is also something to be said about it's hard to counsel an addict or an alcoholic if you hadn't been an alcoholic.
That's
Well, there's
exactly what I'm
something,
saying.
yeah,
Right.
there's something in the shared experience of suffering, but we've all suffered. We've
Okay,
all
I don't think I knew that. That every single person like on this planet or in this
Well,
country has
we've all
experienced.
we've just tracked the generations of who we are. You see, trauma can be passed down up to 9 generations, track 9 generations in the DNA. We've all suffered.
I know, I mean, I do love Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, and thinking about that.
Yeah.
Huh.
We've all suffered.
And so
We've
when
all
your focus is on, going beyond the outer surface level stuff and getting into the grief and shame, for some people, it's maybe learning about generational trauma that they have experienced that maybe they didn't even realize.
Oh, Angela, trauma is any stressful event which is prolonged, overwhelming, and unpredictable. And there's probably not a soul that doesn't go through their present life experience without having had some kind of trauma that they don't even associate as trauma, because we still live in that society. I mean, we still live in a society. I mean, there's so much trauma associated just around birth. There's so much trauma associated within the in utero experience that doctors still don't talk about. Right.
Absolutely.
So then you tap into the generation,
Yeah.
then you tap into slavery, you tap into the Holocaust, you tap into the genocide of the Native Americans, and so on and on and on. And all that's pain that we carry in our DNA.
Yeah.
And we're so quick
I
to get
guess what I'm wondering then is if we've all experienced trauma, then it kind of cancels it out. Like I hear the word trauma used so often, then
Yeah.
what you're describing is it's just human experience,
it is a human experience.
just
And
human nature.
And the catalyst to that, the linchpin, is that we've not grieved. Because we've not grieved, we've been unable to allow another to grieve. And so what happens is then we just carry that energy of that experience in a suppressed way throughout our lives. And it shows up in our relationships with one another.
So what does it look like for you? I'm thinking collective grieving.
Yeah.
My brain actually right now goes to those who have committed harms. So I love like restorative justice, and I'm right now reading this book by Danielle Sered, who does a lot of work on basically in New York. She's created this diversion program for people who are committed, who are convicted of a felony. They don't go to jail. Instead, they go to her program, which is all about restorative justice, understanding the harm you've committed. And so right now I think about adoption agencies, and especially thinking back to the 50s and that era of like sending women away. How part of the issues I think within the adoption sphere is we haven't grieved that, slash some people haven't taken responsibility for those actions.
Mm-hmm.
So what would that look like?
Oh, it even happened. I would say it happens to this day. I think it happens to this day that there are traumas being perpetrated upon women. And so what does that look like? It is helping those individuals who've had those experiences process through what that loss was, and through what that anger was, and through what that fear was, and how that helping them to understand how that shows up in their relationships today. Right? You know that as an adopted child, and based on your experience, you are very sensitive. And that sensitivity is the double-edged sword of trauma. It's the one part of that sensitivity is what allows you to be as successful as you are. The other part of that sensitivity can allow you to be as overwhelmed as you might become.
How do you know this? It's true. Yes.
That's just the nature of what living through highly stressful experiences does to the brain.
Yeah.
At the earliest ages. And so we just have to it's really about being honest about what we've gone through. That could be being honest about what my biological mother went through. And then I have to be really honest about what my adoptive mother went through, and what my biological father went through, and what my adoptive father went. They've all experienced pain and loss, and no one has held them and said it's okay. Let it out.
Please just go over to Donald Trump and do that. Wouldn't our country be a lot better if someone could tell Donald Trump?
Even little Donald at 13, he's still trapped as a 13-year-old in that big body of his.
So sorry to bring his name into this conversation, but I do think like you're right. But so it's mainly individual because part of what I work on is like collective and macro and bigger systems.
We're all connected.
Yeah.
It's individual and it's collective. We're all just a cellular experience together. We all suffer and have suffered. And when we can honor that for ourselves, we can honor that for another person. And then we can listen to stories. When someone's sharing a story, we can listen to a story and hear and feel the foster mom taking a little baby and caressing her and stroking her and loving her until her clenched body relaxed and was able to be nurtured. That's what we can do.
Yeah. It's awesome to hear you say that. When people do think about what my foster parents did for me, the word that they use is it's a miracle. And I'm often like, well, is it though? But I
Yeah,
think what you're saying, people, it's so far from our norm to have people grieve in
that's
that
it.
way. That
It's
instead the label comes
outside
just
of the
like,
norm.
wow, your foster parents were incredible and your body is a miracle.
Yeah, that's it.
Hmm.
What's next for Angela Tucker?
How do you, in professional?
Life.
Right now in my life, I'm um personally doing a lot of work with youth who've aged out of foster care slash adoptees who've been rehomed and have not, it's that age of like 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. I really love that college age, young adult, but working with those who don't feel like they have stability.
It's a
And
hard
this
age.
ties into my mentoring society, the nonprofit I just founded 2 years ago, where it's mentorship for adoptees by adoptees. And so I'm pretty focused on that. But yeah, that age is so tricky, but even more so for those who just don't feel like they have a home. So yeah,
That's fantastic. And that is hard work.
it's quite hard work.
That age is tough. They are coming off of the tail end of usually years of being misunderstood, traumatized, rejected, abandoned, and now stepping into the beginning of adulthood. And that is a that is a hard stage of reckoning.
It really is. And then to put on top of that, like many of the youth who either have lived here with my husband and I, or we've cared for them in some way, just the idea of unconditional love is such a foreign thing, that the people pleasing behaviors are what we work really hard to be like, you don't have to say yes right now to everything we like. Let's work on you saying, no, I actually don't want to do that. That
Yeah.
is like the number one thing we're working on with most of them. And that's sad. It's really sad.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about
And
you? What are you up to?
I have an agency in Northern California working with all ages of at-risk adopted children. So our agency tries to keep them from disrupting placements, and we try to keep them from being sent to residential treatment centers.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm in Washington State, so I'm working with an organization that is tracking this, trying to track how many adopted kids, adopted teens are being raised outside of Washington State, in Utah, in Oregon, at residential treatment centers, at congregate care settings. There's a lot, but it's tricky because it's tricky to find funding because they're not technically wards of the state or in foster care, but they really are.
Yeah, it's tough for sure.
And I've been working for the last year and a half on a documentary about over medication of youth in foster care in California. It's specifically to LA County. And that's fascinating too, to meet 18, 19-year-olds who are on a lot of medication but don't know why. And nobody can tell them why.
Well, I mean, they could if they were honest. They would just tell them because we were afraid of your behaviors and we didn't know what else to do. So we just drugged you to try to make the behaviors go away. And now you're addicted and can't get off of them, or at least you think you can't. But in reality, you can. You just got to work through the pain and the loss and the grief and the stress that drives the behaviors to begin with.
What
And
doctor is going to risk their medical license and be that honest?
that's a part of the problem. Right?
Yes, and it's
Now
also
you have medical licenses and FDAs and all these and insurances, and they all work together. They all work together to create the same thing. So it is really its own matrix that is extremely hard for children to get out of, because you don't have adults that are willing to take you by the hand and lead you out of that mess. But for 20 years, I've been a proponent against medicating children. I'd rather medicate a parent or a teacher before I would medicate a child. You know, but no, you're right. There aren't any psychiatrists. Very few, I'll say. Peter Bryan he wrote a series of books. Probably one of his most popular is called Talking Back to Ritalin, and he also wrote one called Talking Back to Prozac. But he's a psychiatrist that was an avid proponent against the use of medication with children.
wow.
But it's all a part of a system. But no one wants to hear that because they've been conditioned to believe that it's some disorder or some chemical imbalance in the brain, which is just ridiculous in saying it, because there are so many chemicals in the brain and they all function simultaneously. You're not going to manipulate any single one of them with a medication to change behavior. And that's why children end up on multiple medications over and over throughout life.
Oh, I'm stuck with your tweetable of I'd rather medicate the parents than medicate a child. Very powerful. And I love that. I mean, I think about all the work that I do when I have young adults in my care, in my home, and how important it is that I stay regulated. And I do all the things in order to be able to stay regulated.
Yeah.
And
that's not easy. Nothing that I advocate for is actually easy. It's all very difficult. It's simple, but it's not easy. Staying regulated in the presence of stress is probably one of the most difficult things that we do day to day. And so then staying regulated when you've got your own experience of sensitivity and past pain.
right.
You know, it sometimes it feels like it's an impossible task
Yes.
to ask adults to be able to do, but that's when you understand the importance of doing self-work.
Yes.
When you engage your self-work, it makes it a much more doable task. In fact, then there's no other option, because you don't want to force someone to be some way to make you feel better, because you realize that your work of feeling better is your business. It's not their business. And we do that to kids all the time. We medicate kids so they'll behave to make us feel better. That's just the cold, hard, honest truth. No one wants to say that. They want to say we medicate kids so they'll feel better. But that's bullshit. We medicate kids because we don't want them to be hyper. We don't want them to be aggressive. We don't want them to be up at night. We don't want them to eat too much. We don't want them to eat too little. We don't want them to pee on themselves or poop themselves. We don't want them to see things. It scares us. And it runs right back down to the psychiatrists and the pharmaceutical companies who figured out that they can be legalized drug dealers and get away with it and convince everyone that works with some difficult child of it. And yeah, people definitely don't like that opinion.
It's the commonality that I think I hear from both of us is the reticence for, I don't know if it's human nature, if it's Americans to just do a little bit of deeper work. Because it's the same, it's your point around doing the grief work. It's my point for professionals getting beyond skin color. You know, all of it is, it's not, I think what you said, like it's simple and hard. That's how I feel like about a lot of my work and the things I
Yeah.
say. I don't
Mhm.
really think they're that groundbreaking or smart.
Mhm.
It's just hard.
It is hard, and we don't like hard in our society
Why is that?
because hard is stressful.
I I kind of like hard things.
Well, you and I come from hard places. We were
Oh,
we were birthed of hard, so it's not as in our core. It is not as challenging of an energetic experience because
that's
it's
fascinating.
kind of consistent with how we came into the world. It
I
was
think
hard.
that's so fascinating. I feel very frustrated when I will say white people, but it's more than just that. But when
Mhm.
white people use language like, you know, I'm going to go have a really difficult conversation about race, or I'm going to go, I want to enter into these hard spaces and have these difficult conversations. It's kind of like the code language that people are using right now. And I'm always like, can we just not use that word hard or difficult? Because when you put that label on it, then A, that's like your assumption. Maybe we all
Mhm.
don't feel that it's hard or difficult, but then also maybe you're training your brain to like think that it's hard when in reality it's just conversation.
And to feel threatened and to set yourself up to feel threatened and sensitive to the conversation. So
Right.
maybe what I'm doing is I'm preparing myself because I am protecting myself. So if I can say it's going to be a hard conversation, then I'm already protecting myself, which
Mm.
by nature of that energetically, I cannot be open to communication
Whoa.
because I got to try to get my point across in order to defend myself.
Wow.
So you're right. What if we just take away the fact that it's going to be a hard conversation and we're just going to have a conversation? We're going to have a conversation seeking to understand before we are understood and to be open to whatever comes up. And
Yes.
I'm just going to love you as you tell me whatever it is that you need to tell me.
Yes. Expecting different viewpoints, expecting different energies, of course, but it's not a negative.
No, it's just
Yeah.
living.
Right. I love that. I'm sad to hear you say that it's because we come from hard places. I understand and I think I agree, but like you said, if everybody has experienced trauma, then why isn't everybody able to engage?
Well, not everyone's willing to honor the fact that they come from hard places.
It's like an obvious thing to it's easy for us to see that we've come from a hard place because by being adopted, there's been separation. So maybe for those who there's not that obvious
Yeah.
happenstance, they need to do the work to understand there has been trauma in their life.
Yeah,
And
just spend a little bit of time in exploration. What was mom's life like? What was dad's life like? What was grandma and grandpa's dad? Just, I mean, it is really just a little bit of exploration. And sometimes I like to tell my audiences, what was going on with mom and dad when you were in utero? Where were they? Where did they live? What was their experience?
right.
Because we don't
Yes.
think about that. We're not taught and we're not led to think about that far back.
Interesting. I mean, it's fascinating. There's a piece perhaps of curiosity, and I'm wondering if that trait is kind of inborn or learned. But in like a like a love of curiosity. I have always felt curious about most everything. And I ask a lot of questions. And I remember my parents bought me this book called the like 101 Reasons Why. It was like the big book of Tell Me Why. So I'm just like, I don't understand. What in the world? But for many people, and I think of the religious communities, curiosity is like, do not do that. Do not question.
Mhm. That's an interesting thought. And I think we were probably, many of us were raised at some level with that same experience. You don't question the adults.
Right. Children
know,
should be
so-
seen and not heard, or that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Uh,
Let me look at the chat real quick.
Okay.
Annette asks, Brian, do you think we, adopted people, in a sense, also inherit the generational trauma of our adoptive families as well?
Mm. So I have this sense, and I cannot confirm this with any specific research, but my sense is that when we live 6 months or longer with someone else, our cellular systems become enmeshed. And that is actually what causes grief at every level. And so it's whether it's your child or your pet or your aunt or your uncle or your grandma, it doesn't matter. If you've been with someone 6 months or longer, you become cellularly connected with them. So now do you inherit the generations of their trauma at some energetic level? You probably have some exposure to it. It would be hard to grow up with someone. I grew up with a mom and dad who were both children of alcoholics. They were both emotionally absent parents. They were providers, but they were emotionally absent. So that modeling, and we go back and you think about the nature nurture debate, which we know now that the environment has the ability to shape DNA. So at some level, yes, you are experiencing even the generational pain and the DNA trauma, the transmission of generational trauma through even your adoptive families. So Angela, I bet something was very interesting. And I bet when you finally relaxed as an infant, I bet your face just turned. That would have been the most miraculous thing ever to see you just turn on, because you're when you said you're very curious, I can see that glimmer, that kind of glow in your eyes. It's fantastic. I'm so very thankful for you and in your life journey. It's amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm truly touched.
Thank you. Yes, I know that I received I got my hearing aids when I was 5 years old. So they didn't know that I really wasn't hearing from until I was 5. And I think I was definitely like some of those viral videos that you see when a kid hears their mom's voice for the first time. And just and I feel like it's stayed that strong for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
Just like very curious, very interested and intrigued by the world, and my playground just happens to be my life story around adoption, which is
Yeah.
endlessly scintillating.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Brian, this was a joy, and Pat was right that we could have a conversation kind of unscripted and just allow it to go wherever it goes. That's really awesome.
Absolutely. My pleasure. And I look forward to seeing you in New York at the conference.
I would add, I feel like an unscripted conversation is perhaps what some people consider hard.
Mm.
And for us, maybe it's role modeling what we've been talking about, which is being open to exploring where things go.
Yeah.
That can be scary for some, and for us, I guess it's not. And what happens is a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. I feel like
Yes.
that's ultimately, if we're going to be important figures in the field of adoption and children and families and trauma, then we have to be willing to go and lead before we ask other people to do the same. I always tell my staff, I'm not going to ask you to go anywhere that I haven't been willing to go and am not willing to go 1,000 times before I ask you to do it. So
Love
you
it.
so-
Can't wait to see you. Can't
All
wait to see
right, you
everybody.
too.